Welcome to Revenge Report. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let's dive in. Thanksgiving dinner at Marco's felt like a well-oiled machine, too polished for my taste. The china gleamed, the centerpiece was immaculate, and the conversation was stiff with formality. I sat at the far end of the table, far enough to avoid being a part of the show. Marco, as usual, had the center of attention. He leaned back, hands wide, preparing his latest tale, a story from a recent wildfire response. And then, in the face of all that smoke, I found the missing team. "We barely got out alive," Marco said, eyes flashing. "Not all heroes wear capes. Some of us wear fire suits." I could hear the dramatic pause in his voice as he absorbed the praise, the nods, the wide eyes. It was like clockwork. Marco loved this. The way everyone looked up to him. The way everyone believed he was the one who saved the day. And then he turned on me. "So, Lisa," Marco said loudly, his gaze snapping to me like a dart, "what did you do during that wildfire?" "Probably hiding behind your clipboard, like usual. All that paperwork while we're out there risking our lives." The table fell dead silent. I could feel the awkward tension thickening the air. Some family members laughed nervously, like this was just another round of sibling banter. But Marco's tone wasn't playful. It was pointed, malicious. I kept my eyes on my plate, didn't flinch. I didn't have to react. Emily, my 10-year-old daughter, sat beside me, her eyes wide, flicking between Marco and me. I could hear her barely their breath. "Come on, Lisa," Marco pressed, louder now, his grin too sharp. "A clipboard queen is all you are. What real work have you ever done?" The words were designed to provoke me, to make me explode, to make me show weakness. But I wouldn't. Not here. Not now. "Marco, let it go," I said, finally breaking my silence, my voice calm but firm. "You're out of line." His eyes narrowed. The silence thickened again, and the tension built. "You don't want to prove me wrong, do you?" He pressed, his voice growing louder. But I said nothing. I'd said all I needed to say. Emily stood up slowly, her small frame somehow filling the space around her. The quiet weight of her movement snapped everyone's attention toward her. I could feel the shift. Her eyes locked with Marco's, and for the first time in all these years, I saw her hold herself with the kind of calm that didn't belong to a 10-year-old. My heart skipped. This was my daughter. I didn't know how this was going to go, but I wasn't about to stop her. She raised her tablet, the soft glow of the screen lighting her face. "I want you to hear what you already said." She pressed play, and the room went dead silent. It was Marco's voice, clear as day, from a small city recognition event 2 years ago. "I want to thank Lisa Ramos for coordinating an impossible supply run during Hurricane Constance. Without her, we would have never been able to deliver the essentials to the shelter in time. She's a lifesaver." The words hit harder than I thought they would. I wasn't expecting the sting. I wasn't expecting to feel seen in front of the people who had so often overlooked me. The air in the room froze. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting from Marco to me. Marco's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. It's out of context," he finally stammered, his voice unsteady. His grin faltered, but he quickly tried to recover. "You know, that's not what I meant." Emily didn't back down. "There's more," she said quietly, pressing another button on her tablet. Another clip started playing, this time from a city council meeting. Marco standing at a podium, his voice full of praise again. "We owe a huge debt to Lisa Ramos. She was the one who made sure the evacuation happened smoothly, coordinated all the teams, and didn't let a single person get left behind. I'm proud to work alongside her." It was a punch to the gut, not because of the words themselves, but because of the weight of them. The fact that Marco had said them, in front of everyone. He had spoken about me as if I were part of the team, part of the mission. And then my daughter added, in a voice that was still calm but sharp, "I've already sent the videos to Grandpa." Marco's head jerked like he'd been slapped. His hand twitched, like he was about to reach for the tablet, but Emily took a small step back, holding it steady. Marco's smile faltered again, the nervous tremble in his fingers betraying the cracks in his control. "Emily, this is ridiculous," he snapped, trying to take command again. "You can't just, these are doctored. The recordings, they're not real." Emily didn't flinch. She didn't blink. "You said it. I just kept it safe." There it was, the unspoken truth hanging in the air. I could feel the tension rippling through the room, the eyes of the family turning, some shocked, others ashamed. But I didn't look at them. I kept my focus on Marco, watching him squirm. His smile was gone now. He wiped his hand over his face, then glanced at the table, anywhere but at me or Emily. You can't just... But the words had already lost their weight. Emily had built her case, and now there was no denying it. Not in front of the family, not with Grandpa already informed. And suddenly, it wasn't just about the recordings. It was about the truth he had been trying to erase all along. The front door swung open, and in walked my father. At 75, he still carried the kind of presence that made the room shift when he entered. His shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, and behind him, 2 county officials stepped in. I recognized them immediately. Frank and Al, both seasoned, both in the know about the intricacies of emergency management. "Everyone, sit down," my father said, his voice cutting through the tension. He didn't raise it, but it had that unmistakable authority behind it that made the whole room follow suit without question. I could feel Marco stiffen next to me as he realized what was happening. Without another word, my father placed a thick folder on the table, the sound of it hitting the wood loud and deliberate. He slid it toward Marco. "This isn't just a family conversation anymore, Marco," he said quietly, but with weight behind every word. The words hung in the air like a quiet storm before it broke. Marco shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier bravado now completely gone. He was pale, his hands fidgeting as he looked at the folder in front of him, then back at the 2 county officials who had entered behind my father. My father didn't wait for Marco to respond. He opened the folder and pulled out the first sheet. He read aloud, his voice steady. "Here's a documented inconsistency in your after-action report for Hurricane Constance, Marco. Lisa's name has been removed from the planning acknowledgments despite her clear involvement in the operation. The same thing happens in at least 3 other reports I've reviewed from the past year." I could see Marco's fingers curl into fists under the table. He tried to laugh it off. "You know how these things go, Dad. Mistakes happen. Reports get shuffled." But his laugh was thin, nervous. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like he'd aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. My father didn't respond. He flipped to another page and read again. "This one's from a former fire captain, Captain Harris," he said, glancing up. He states, and I quote, "Lisa coordinated the evacuation of the hospital under impossible conditions during the Constance disaster. It was her leadership that kept us on track, and without it, we would have lost lives." My heart hammered in my chest. The weight of hearing it again, out loud, was almost suffocating. I'd been quietly carrying those memories for so long, but now they weren't just mine. The truth was laid out, in black and white, for everyone to see. The room was so quiet now that I could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Even Marco didn't speak. He couldn't. His face was tight, his lips pressed together as if he were biting back something. Probably a defense, an excuse, or a denial. But none of that mattered now. The words had already been said. My father looked over at Marco, his gaze sharp. "You've been erasing Lisa's contributions, Marco. This isn't about family politics anymore. It's about the integrity of the work we do." The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was deadly serious. The uncomfortable murmurs that had once filled the room were gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. Marco shifted again, looking to the officials behind my father as if he expected them to speak up, to defend him. But Frank and Al just stood there, arms crossed, waiting. They knew exactly what this was about. They'd seen the reports. They'd seen the discrepancies. This wasn't just a family argument anymore. It was about the damage Marco had done, not just to me, but to the integrity of the work we did. Marco opened his mouth to say something but stopped himself. His lips parted again, but nothing came out. His shoulders slumped as he realized that the fight had already been won. The facts were staring him in the face, and he couldn't wish them away. My father's gaze never wavered. "You can try to laugh this off, son, but I think we all know what's happening here. And it's not just you and me anymore. It's about the people we've worked with, the lives we've touched, the truth we're supposed to uphold." I didn't look away. I didn't need to. My father had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, it cut through everything. And this time, the silence in the room was his voice. Marco didn't say another word. He just stared down at the folder, the color drained from his face, the weight of his actions now inescapable. The room still felt heavy with silence when Emily stood again, her small hands steady as she tapped at the screen of her tablet. Her voice broke the tension, calm as always. "There's more," she said, and the words hung in the air like a challenge. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on the screen, focused. The first clip played, Marco, at a memorial service. The microphone crackled faintly as his voice filled the room. "Lisa deserves recognition for her part in the wildfire evacuation last year. It was her coordination that saved lives, even when we were all running on fumes. She's a true hero in this field." The air in the room shifted again, as if the walls themselves were closing in on Marco. The faces of the family, previously uncertain, started to change. Some people shifted in their chairs, others exchanged glances. Even the people who had been the most sympathetic to Marco before were starting to get uncomfortable. They were beginning to realize what was happening. Emily didn't wait for anyone to speak. She played the next clip, this time from a barbecue, Marco's voice clear over the background noise of laughter and clinking glasses. "Lisa did more than anyone could ask during that citywide evacuation. The way she handled logistics, coordinated with other agencies, it was the difference between life and death for so many." A few people murmured, voices low and edged with disbelief. Marco's face had drained of color, his jaw clenched tight, but he didn't interrupt. He just sat there, fighting to control his breathing. The third clip began, a city council meeting. Marco again, speaking with the kind of authority he reserved for public events. "I want to make sure that everyone knows the unsung heroes of the city's disaster response. Lisa Ramos was right there with us. She led the charge when we needed her most, and it's time people started recognizing that." The murmur in the room grew louder, more pronounced. It was no longer just the family. Even the distant cousins who had laughed off Marco's earlier jabs were starting to look uncomfortable. They were hearing the truth, plain as day. Marco's voice cracked when he spoke again, his tone now desperate, trying to regain control. This isn't fair. You've turned Emily into some kind of spy, digging through my past, trying to make me look bad." I felt the anger rise, but I didn't move, didn't let it control me. I wasn't going to react the way he expected. "Emily didn't make you look bad, Marco," I said, my voice steady. "She documented your words. If they're true, they hold up." I could see the flicker of panic in his eyes. He was trying to regroup, trying to salvage whatever scraps of authority he thought he still had left, but he couldn't. A cousin from my mother's side, someone I barely knew, spoke up quietly, almost to herself. "I remember you mentioning her name back then, when we were talking about the wildfire. You said she was key to getting everyone out." Her words hit like a pinprick in the silence. Suddenly, there was another voice, another validation. Marco's head snapped toward her, his lips twisting in frustration. Emily remained calm, her gaze unwavering. "You said it. I just kept it safe." A few more people nodded, and the room was starting to crumble around Marco. The weight of the evidence was too much. Even if he could dismiss Emily's recordings as something out of context, he couldn't dismiss the truth staring him in the face. His own words, on repeat, confirming what he'd worked so hard to bury. His hands gripped the edge of the table, and his voice wavered. "This doesn't mean anything," he muttered, trying to hold on to something. "It's all just words. Words don't mean anything." "Words matter when they're true," I said, not looking away from him. "Words matter when they're backed by facts. And the truth is, you've been erasing mine for years." The room was quiet now, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional sigh. No one had anything else to say. There was nothing more to argue. The truth had been laid bare. Marco had nothing left to hide behind. Marco's hands shot out, reaching for the tablet, but Emily was already stepping back, her calmness making her movements precise. She didn't flinch, didn't look afraid. She just held the tablet a little farther out of his reach, her expression steady, unyielding. "There are 3 copies," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You taking this doesn't erase it." The words hit with the force of a brick, and Marco froze. His fingers twitched, but he didn't make a grab for it again. I could see his jaw clench, the last of his control slipping. He couldn't fix this by force. He couldn't fix it at all. I didn't flinch. I knew my role in this moment. I wasn't going to make it worse. My training kicked in. When you manage disasters, you learn how to control the chaos around you. You manage the storm without becoming part of it. I wasn't going to let Marco provoke me. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me react. The room was a pressure cooker. Marco's frustration was so thick it was like I could feel it pressing against me, but I stayed calm. I wasn't going to let him drag me into an emotional fight. A voice from the back of the room broke the stillness. My uncle, his voice firm and tired. This isn't teasing, Marco. This is erasure. You've been doing it for years. The words hung in the air, and for a split second, Marco's eyes flickered with something like guilt, but he quickly masked it, and his gaze darted around the room, looking for support. He found none. A cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to in ages, leaned forward, their tone quiet but sure. Yeah, I remember you talking about Lisa when we were at that barbecue last summer. You said she was the one who kept everything organized when the hospital was evacuating. The cousin's eyes flicked briefly to me, then back to Marco. Maybe you should have remembered that. Another voice chimed in, this one a distant aunt who'd always been Marco's cheerleader. Marco shifted in his seat, visibly deflating. His face twisted with a mix of anger and embarrassment, but I could see the cracks forming. The narrative he'd built around himself, the one that painted him as the hero, the one who did everything, was falling apart, and he didn't have the strength to hold it up anymore. Finally, his wife spoke, her voice flat, drained. You told this story, Marco, she said. You made sure everyone knew how much you did. Now, make it right. Her words landed like a punch. I saw Marco's posture fold in on itself, the weight of her disappointment, a blow he didn't expect. He opened his mouth, trying to find a defense, but nothing came out. You don't understand, he said, his voice weak, almost pleading. This is the system. The way it works, I had to be the face of everything. I had to be the one out there, in front of the cameras, smiling and shaking hands. The system pushed me into that role. I didn't have a choice. I almost didn't want to respond. I almost wanted to let him drown in his excuses, but I couldn't leave it hanging. The system didn't make you erase me, Marco, I said, my voice calm but firm. You made that choice. You chose to leave me out. You chose to take the credit and bury my work. His face flushed, and I could see the fight draining out of him. He opened his mouth to speak again, but nothing came. He just sat there, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes darting around the room, trying to hold on to something, anything, that could save him. But the truth had already been laid out. It didn't matter how many excuses he tried to pile on top. The words, the recordings, the memories, they were too strong. I didn't need to say anything else. The weight of everything that had happened, of the erasure, the years of silence, was now inescapable. Marco had been exposed, not just to me, but to the entire family. His control was gone. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it had its own weight. My father slid a folder across the table, the contents crisp, official, a document that would settle this once and for all. It was simple, a formal correction, reinstating my name on the shared city commendation that Marco had claimed as his own. The paper lay between us. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. My father, with his calm authority, had already made sure that the facts were in order. Sign it, Marco, my father said, his voice devoid of emotion. It's time to correct this. Marco didn't respond immediately. He sat there staring at the document like it might sprout wings and fly away. His hand hovered over the paper, his fingers twitching. I could see the internal struggle, the last bits of pride that he was clinging to, the remnants of the role he'd built for himself as the city's hero. He didn't want to let go, but the room wasn't going to let him escape. Not anymore. The silence stretched long, uncomfortable. I didn't look away from him. I didn't need to say a word. All the talking had been done. The recordings, the testimonies, the paperwork, it was all right there. Finally, with a sharp exhale, Marco lowered his hand and took the pen. His signature was shaky, unsteady, as if even the act of acknowledging the truth physically hurt him. It was all a show at that point, though, a weak attempt at maintaining some kind of control. But there was nothing left to control. The moment was slipping through his fingers. The second the pen lifted from the paper, a voice broke the quiet. I was there during Constance, a neighbor said softly, his words carrying more weight than any of Marco's attempts at justification. He was an older man, someone who had always been skeptical of my role in these events. He'd never given me much credit before, never acknowledged what I'd done. But now he did. I remember her voice on the radio, he continued, his eyes fixed on Marco. She ran that whole grid. Lisa kept the whole operation going when everything else was falling apart. His words settled in the room, anchoring the truth even deeper. They weren't just memories, they were facts, witnessed and remembered by someone else. Someone who couldn't be erased either. Marco's shoulders slumped and his posture deflated, like a balloon with the air slowly leaking out. I could see the last of his defiance draining away. The paper lay there, the line finally corrected. The weight of that moment, of all the years I had spent in silence, finally shifted. I hadn't needed to fight for it. I hadn't needed to raise my voice or beg for acknowledgement. It had been there all along. The truth, the proof, the facts. And the room had no choice but to accept them. Marco didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His body language had already said everything. The document was signed, the record was set straight, the family didn't move, didn't speak. The only sound was the soft rustle of the paper as my father collected the folder. I stayed still, letting the quiet hang there for a moment longer. I wasn't looking for closure. I wasn't looking for some emotional reconciliation. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was for the truth to be acknowledged. And for the first time in a long time, it had been. 6 weeks passed, and though the storm inside our family had settled, the ripples still moved through the air. The letter came in the mail one morning, official looking and neatly folded with the city's seal pressed in dark blue ink. I held it for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the acknowledgement I had been denied for so long. I opened it, hand steady despite the rush of emotions. The formal correction letter was short, to the point. My name officially restored to the shared city commendation Marco had claimed as his own. There was no fanfare, no apology from the city, just a quiet acknowledgement that the error had been corrected. That was all I needed. I didn't say anything when I finished reading it, but Emily, who had been sitting beside me, leaned over and asked, "Can we frame it?" Her question hung in the air for a second before I nodded. "Yeah, we can frame it." She grinned and ran to grab a frame from the shelf. It was a simple thing, but it felt right. The letter wasn't about victory or revenge. It wasn't about rubbing anything in anyone's face. It was about fixing what had been wronged. And somehow, that felt more satisfying than any grand gesture. Emily carefully placed the letter inside the frame, then set it beside a photograph of the handwritten note Marco had given me after Hurricane Constance. It had always been a small, personal reminder of that moment, his words of praise, his acknowledgement of the work I did. But now, framed beside the letter, it felt different. Like a record of something that had finally come full circle. Word spread quickly among my colleagues in the emergency network. A few quietly reached out to thank me for standing firm, for not letting it slide, for holding the line. I didn't need their thanks, but it was nice to hear. It was validation in its own way. They understood. They had seen how the system worked, and sometimes how it failed to work. They knew the importance of keeping records, of standing up for what was right, no matter how many years it took. I didn't let the gratitude sink in for too long. There was work to do. The first new thing I did was start a documentation workshop for incoming FEMA recruits. I called it Paper and Integrity. Simple, straightforward. I wanted them to understand the value of the records they kept, the truth they documented, because one thing I'd learned in all those years of logistics was that nothing was more valuable than the facts. They didn't lie, and they didn't change. You needed them in a crisis, and you needed them afterward, too. Emily helped with the workshop, of course. She had an eye for detail, a skill that she'd learned from watching me, even if she didn't know it at the time. She had her own little corner in the office where she sorted through case files and organized things with the precision of a seasoned pro. One afternoon, as we sat together, Emily looked up from her work. "I made a checklist for the caseworkers," she said, her voice serious. She handed me a piece of paper she'd printed out. It read, "My story, in my words." I looked at her, impressed. "That's perfect," she smiled, proud. "I thought it would help them remember. It's not just about the paperwork. It's about what happens behind it. The people I hung the checklist on the wall of the office, right next to the frame with the letter and Marco's note. A reminder in its own way that no matter how complicated things got, the truth had to be preserved. It had to be written down, remembered. As I watched her manage the files with a quiet confidence, I realized something. The battle for recognition wasn't over, and maybe it never would be. But this, what I was building with Emily, with my work, this felt more like what I'd been fighting for all along. The integrity, the accuracy, the ability to tell our stories the right way. And that was enough. A few months after the workshop kicked off, I found myself standing at the head of a new table, a different table, in a different room. The nonprofit was small, still in its early stages, but the vision was clear: to help displaced families after disasters, to give them a place to land, to rebuild, but most of all, to make sure their stories were heard. I had spent years navigating the chaos of FEMA operations, managing logistics, ensuring supplies and people reached the right places at the right time. But now, I was on the other side, building systems to support people, not just during a crisis, but after. The paperwork was different, the stakes were personal, but the rhythm was the same. I built intake processes, created systems for flagging the gaps where people felt invisible, because I knew what it was like to be overlooked, to have your role erased. The framed commendation and Marco's note sat above my desk. They weren't trophies, they were proof that truth mattered, proof that things had been set right, even if it had taken years to get there. Emily, as always, was by my side. After school, she came to the office, tagging documents, logging dates, times, names. It was second nature to her now, this methodical approach to remembering. She was learning how to preserve what mattered, how to make sure the story was told in the right way. One day, as we worked together, she looked up from her pile of papers and said, "Do you think this is enough? I mean, helping people after disasters, is that enough?" I paused, thinking for a moment. I think it's enough when you know you've made a difference, when you've helped people feel seen, even if it's just for a moment. She nodded, turning back to her work. I watched her for a second, thinking about how much she'd grown. She was part of this, part of the process, and I could tell that she wasn't just learning logistics. She was learning that people mattered, that their stories needed to be kept. One afternoon, my father came by for his usual check-in. He didn't say much, but I saw him glance at the frames above my desk, then walk over to adjust them slightly, just enough to be sure they were straight. "Looks straight," he said with a satisfied nod, his voice warm. It was a simple statement, but it meant something to me. It always had. My father was a man who knew when things were aligned, when the pieces fit. "Thanks, Dad," I said, smiling. It felt like a small moment, but it was a moment of peace, too. The kind of peace that comes from knowing the right things are in place, that the foundation you've built is solid, and that you can keep building. It was late, well past midnight, when my phone rang. The number on the screen stopped me for a moment. Marco, my brother. I let it ring twice, then picked up. "Marco!" There was a long pause before he spoke. His voice was ragged, a little worn. "I'm sorry." I didn't say anything at first. I was still waiting for him to say more, for the words to become something clearer, something more real. But there was only silence on the other end. He was still figuring out what he wanted to say, I could tell. What he needed to say. "I don't know what this is supposed to mean," he continued, stumbling over his words. "I don't know if I'm apologizing for what I did or for getting caught, but I need to start owning it. What I erased, what I took from you." I took a breath, steadying myself. It was strange, hearing him say it out loud after all this time. "What do you want, Marco?" He hesitated again. "Not forgiveness yet. Not from you. I need a chance to make it right, to fix what I've been ignoring. I've been doing some work. I joined a peer support group. Been fixing donated medical gear on weekends." I waited, listening, but my heart didn't soften. I wasn't looking for him to have an epiphany, wasn't hoping for a magical apology. I was listening to see if this was real. "You erased me publicly," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "The repair has to be public too." There was another pause. This time, it felt like he was trying to find something solid to hold on to. "I know, I'm going to fix it. I'll make it right." It didn't feel like enough, but it was something. And that something was more than I'd ever gotten from him before. He cleared his throat, the words awkward, like he wasn't sure if they would come out the way he wanted. "I want to return the note. The one I gave you after Constance. The one I wrote in my own handwriting." I knew exactly what he was talking about. The note I had kept all these years, tucked in a drawer. The one that had felt like a small piece of validation, back then. A token of his acknowledgement. I didn't hesitate. "Bring it. Emily will want to see where you hang it." The words landed heavier than I thought they would, but they were clear. I wasn't doing this for Marco. I wasn't doing it for some warm family moment. I was doing it for Emily, to show her that accountability had to be more than just lip service, to teach her that actions spoke louder than apologies. Marco didn't respond right away. There was a long stretch of silence. Then, finally, "Okay, I'll bring it. I'll figure out how to make it right." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "You will. But it has to be your choice, Marco. And it has to be real." He sighed, a sound full of exhaustion and perhaps the faintest hint of relief. "I'll do it. I promise." The conversation ended with that. No grand gestures or emotional reunions. Just a quiet understanding that maybe, for the first time, we were finally having an honest conversation. It wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about closure. It was about something simpler: accountability. And that, I thought, was a step worth taking. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes that was enough. The nonprofit had become a place where truth was not just a value, but a process. It thrived, not because we offered flashy services, but because we offered clarity, clear systems, clear intake processes, and the kind of transparency that let people know their stories mattered. When families came in after a disaster, they filled out forms, yes, but more importantly, they were given space to tell their stories. Dates, signatures, timelines. It all mattered, and it had to be accurate. Emily was with me every week, sitting alongside clients, her small hands carefully logging everything, helping them sort through their lives one piece at a time. She was learning how to listen, how to pay attention to what people said, how to make sure their truth was never erased. "Your story matters," she would remind them, her voice steady and sure, like a little guide who understood the weight of those words. One Saturday, Marco showed up. No announcement, no fanfare. He just appeared, rolled up his sleeves, and started helping with the usual weekend cleanup. He didn't speak much. I didn't expect him to. He stayed late, folding chairs and stacking boxes, blending into the background. I noticed him pass by the framed commendation, the one that had taken so long to get. He didn't stop, didn't comment, but I saw him glance at it, a brief look, and then he moved on. There was something in the way he looked at it, though. Something that said he had seen it, really seen it, for the first time. That night, when Emily and I were walking home, we followed our usual route, the long way, down the quiet streets where the world seemed a little more manageable. The air was crisp, and she had her hand tucked in mine. We talked about everything and nothing, like we always did on those walks. The kind of talk that comes when there's no rush to get anywhere. She asked about the day at the nonprofit, about the clients we'd helped. I answered her, just as calmly as I always did. But this time, after a few beats of silence, she looked up at me and said, "Do you think things are better now?" I thought about it for a moment. "I think we didn't become perfect, Emily, but we became accurate." She looked up at me, processing the words, and then gave me a small nod. "Accurate," she repeated. "That's enough, right?" I squeezed her hand and smiled. "That's enough." When we got home, we did the usual things. Checked that the frames were level, made sure everything was in its place. These small rituals were what kept us grounded. The simple acts of making sure things were where they needed to be. No more, no less. It wasn't about making the world perfect. It was about making it right, one piece at a time. And in that moment, I knew that was all I could ask for. We'd set the record straight, and that was enough.